In the heart of Texas during World War II, a simple breakfast changed everything. When a ranch cook served up a mountain of bacon and eggs to German prisoners of war. Hardened soldiers who'd survived years of battle and hunger suddenly broke down in tears. What was it about this meal that touched them so deeply? This is the true story of how kindness and a Texas breakfast brought hope to men far from home. In the heart of Texas, where the land stretches wide and the sun rises golden over endless fields, a story unfolded during World War II that few could have imagined. It was a story not of battles or generals, but of ordinary people, simple acts, and the power of kindness. It began with a breakfast bacon, eggs, and a group of German prisoners of war, far from home, who would never forget what happened that morning. The year was 1944. Across the Atlantic, Europe was in flames. The Allied armies were pushing deeper into Nazi-occupied territory, and the tide of war was turning. But in the United States, life was different. The war was present, yes, rationing, blackouts, and the constant hum of factories working day and night, but the land itself was untouched. In Texas, ranches still ran cattle, fields still grew wheat, and the rhythms of rural life continued. Even as the world changed, it was here, on a sprawling ranch outside a small Texas town, that a group of German POWs found themselves one hot summer. Captured in North Africa and Europe, they had been shipped across the ocean, processed through camps, and sent to work on American farms and ranches. For many, it was their first glimpse of the United States, a land they had heard about only in propaganda, a place of cowboys, oil wells, and endless space. The ranch was run by the Johnson family, who had lived on the land for generations. Like many Texans, they were proud, independent, and practical. The war had taken their sons and brothers, sent them to fight in distant lands. Labor was scarce, and the government offered a solution. German prisoners, under God, could help with the harvest, mend fences, and tend the cattle. It was a strange arrangement, but one that worked. The POWs were paid a small wage, given decent quarters, and, most importantly, fed 3 meals a day. For the German prisoners, life on the ranch was a world away from the front lines. The barracks were simple but clean. The guards were strict but fair. The work was hard, but it was honest, and the air was filled with the scent of grass and cattle, not gunpowder and fear. At night, the men would gather in their bunks, sharing stories of home, of battles lost and won, of families left behind. Some were die-hard Nazis, still loyal to the Reich. Others were just young men, swept up in a war they never wanted. But it was the food that made the greatest impression. In Germany, the war had brought hunger. Rations were meager, bread was stale, and meat was a rare luxury. Here, in Texas, the tables groaned with food. There was bread, butter, beans, and on special days bacon. The first time the cook, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Maybell, fried up a mountain of bacon and eggs for breakfast, the smell drifted across the yard, drawing the POWs like moths to a flame. One of the prisoners, a young man named Hans, would later write in his diary, "I woke to the smell of something I had not known in years, bacon, real bacon, the kind my mother used to cook on Sundays. Before the war, I thought I was dreaming." The men filed into the mess hall, eyes wide, stomachs rumbling. They sat at the long wooden tables, hands folded, waiting for the signal to eat. When the plates were set before them piled high with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread, there was a moment of silence. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered prayers of thanks, and then, as they took their first bites, something remarkable happened. Tears welled in the eyes of hardened soldiers. Some tried to hide it, turning away, wiping their faces with rough hands. Others let the tears fall unashamed. The taste of bacon, the warmth of the food, the kindness of the cook, it was too much. For a moment, the war faded away, and they were just young men. Far from home, remembering better days, Mrs. Maybelle watched from the kitchen, her heart aching. She had lost a son in the Pacific, another fighting in Europe. She knew the pain of war, the emptiness it left behind. But she also knew the power of a good meal, the comfort it could bring. She cooked for the POWs as she would for her own boys, with love and care. After breakfast, the men returned to their work, quieter than usual. Some wrote letters home, describing the meal in detail. Others sat in the shade, lost in thought. The guards, too, were moved. They had seen the prisoners as the enemy, but now they saw them as men hungry, homesick, and grateful for a simple kindness. That morning became a legend on the ranch. The story spread among the POWs, told and retold in the barracks at night. It was a story of bacon, yes, but also of hope, of humanity, and of the small acts that can change a life. The days on the Texas ranch settled into a steady rhythm. The German POWs rose before dawn, their breath visible in the cool morning air as they lined up for roll call. The guards, mostly local men too old or too young for combat, watched with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. For the prisoners, the work was hard but honest, mending fences, hauling hay, tending cattle, and helping with the harvest. The Texas sun was relentless, but so was the sense of purpose that came with each day's labor. For many of the POWs, the ranch was their first real taste of America. They marveled at the vastness of the land, the endless sky, and the easy camaraderie of the ranch hands. Some of the Americans were wary at first, keeping their distance from the Krauts, as they called them. But over time, barriers began to fall. The Germans proved themselves to be good workers, skilled, reliable, and eager to earn the small wages they were paid. They learned a few words of English, enough to joke with the cowboys or ask for a second helping at dinner. The food continued to be a revelation. Even the simplest meals, beans and cornbread, stew and potatoes, were a feast compared to what the men had known in Germany. But it was breakfast that remained the highlight. Every few weeks, when the ranch slaughtered a hog, Mrs. Maybelle would fry up another mountain of bacon. The smell would drift across the yard, and the POWs would gather, anticipation written on their faces. Each time, the memory of that first breakfast returned, and with it, a sense of gratitude that words could not express. Hans, the young POW who had written about the bacon in his diary, became something of a spokesman for the group. He was educated, spoke a little English, and had a gentle manner that put people at ease. One morning, after another bacon breakfast, he approached Mrs. Maybelle in the kitchen. He struggled for the right words, finally settling on a simple, heartfelt thank. She smiled, patted his hand, and replied, "You're welcome, son. Everybody deserves a good meal." The kindness shown by the ranchers and their cook began to change the POWs. Some, who had arrived bitter and angry, softened. Others, who had clung to Nazi ideology, found their beliefs challenged by the decency of their captors. The men talked late into the night, debating politics, sharing stories of home, and wondering what the future would hold. For the first time in years, hope crept back into their hearts. The guards, too, were changed. At first, they had kept a strict distance, enforcing the rules with military precision. But as the weeks passed, they saw the POWs not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, young men far from home, missing their families, trying to make the best of a bad situation. Some of the guards began to relax, sharing cigarettes or swapping stories about ranch life. A few even taught the Germans how to play dominoes, a Texas tradition. One of the most remarkable changes came in the form of letters. The POWs were allowed to write home, and many described their experiences in glowing terms. They wrote of the kindness of the Americans, the abundance of food, and the beauty of the Texas landscape. Some families in Germany could hardly believe the stories after years of propaganda about the cruelty of the Allies. The reality was almost too good to be true. The ranchers, for their part, saw the POWs as a blessing. With so many local men away at war, the extra hands made the difference between a successful harvest and a failed one. The Germans worked hard, took pride in their labor, and brought a sense of order and discipline to the ranch. In return, the ranchers treated them with respect, following the rules set by the Geneva Convention and their own sense of decency. But not everyone in the community approved. Some neighbors grumbled about coddling the enemy, and a few resented the presence of the POWs. There were rumors of escape attempts, though in truth, few prisoners wanted to run. Where would they go? The distances were vast, the language unfamiliar, and the consequences severe. Most were content to wait out the war, grateful for the relative comfort and safety of the ranch. As the months passed, the POWs became part of the fabric of ranch life. They attended Sunday services, worked alongside the ranch hands, and even took part in local celebrations. On the 4th of July, the ranchers organized a picnic, complete with barbecue, music, and fireworks. The POWs watched in awe as the sky lit up, some cheering, others lost in thought. For a moment, the divisions of war seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. Yet, beneath the surface, the pain of separation lingered. The POWs missed their families, worried about loved ones back home, and wondered what the future would bring. Some had lost brothers or fathers in the fighting. Others feared what would happen when the war ended. Would they be sent home, or held as prisoners for years? The uncertainty was a heavy burden, but the kindness of the ranchers and the comfort of good food made it easier to bear. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Hans sat with a group of fellow prisoners, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. He pulled out his diary and wrote, "Today, we ate bacon again. I thought of my mother, of home, of the life I hope to return to. I am grateful for this place, for these people, for the chance to remember what it means to be human." The story of the Texas ranch and its German POWs was not unique. Across the United States, thousands of prisoners found themselves in similar situations, working on farms, building roads, or helping with the harvest. In many cases, the kindness of ordinary Americans left a lasting impression, changing hearts and minds in ways that no battle ever could. As autumn approached and the days grew shorter, the POWs prepared for another winter on the ranch. The work continued, the meals remained hearty, and the bonds between prisoners and ranchers deepened. The memory of that first bacon breakfast lingered, a symbol of hope and humanity in a world torn apart by war. Winter on the Texas ranch brought a new set of challenges and a different kind of beauty. The mornings were cold, the grass frosted silver, and the wind cut through even the thickest coats. Yet the work never stopped. The German POWs, now seasoned hands, rose before dawn, their breath clouding in the crisp air as they gathered for roll call. The guards stamped their feet to keep warm, and Mrs. Mabel's kitchen glowed with light and the promise of another hot breakfast. Inside the mess hall, the atmosphere had changed. The POWs no longer sat in stiff, weary silence. There was laughter now, and the easy banter of men who had come to know each other's stories. Some of the prisoners had picked up enough English to joke with the ranch hands, and a few of the Americans had learned German phrases in return. The barriers of language and suspicion had given way to a kind of mutual respect. The food remained a source of wonder. Even as rationing tightened across the country, the ranchers made sure the POWs were fed well. Mrs. Maybell, ever resourceful, found ways to stretch the supplies, adding more beans to the stew, baking cornbread from scratch, and saving bacon for special mornings. On those days, the smell of frying bacon would drift across the yard, and the POWs would gather early, eager for a taste of home. One morning, as snowflakes drifted down outside, Hans found himself sitting next to one of the older ranch hands, a man named Earl. Earl was a quiet man, his face weathered by years in the sun, but he had a soft spot for the POWs. He poured Hans a cup of coffee and said, "You boys work hard. Reminds me of my own sons, off fighting somewhere in Europe. War's a hell of a thing, ain't it?" Hans nodded, and sure of the right words, he thought of his own father, lost on the Eastern Front, and the ache of homesickness that never quite left him. "Yes, sir," he replied softly. "War is very hard." Earl clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, you're here now, and as long as you're here, you're part of this place. Don't let anyone tell you different." That sense of belonging, however fragile, was a lifeline for the POWs. The ranch became a world apart from the war, a place where they could remember who they were before the uniforms, before the battles, before the loss. Some of the men began to help with chores beyond their assigned duties, fixing broken equipment, mending clothes, or even teaching the ranchers a few tricks they'd learned back in Germany. The guards, too, had changed. The initial suspicion had faded, replaced by a kind of watchful trust. There were still rules, of course, curfews, head counts, and the ever-present barbed wire, but the relationship was no longer adversarial. The guards and prisoners shared cigarettes, played cards, and sometimes even swapped stories about their families. The war, for a few hours each day, seemed very far away. Letters from home became precious treasures. The POWs would gather round when the mail arrived, hoping for news from loved ones. Some letters brought joy, a new baby, a wedding, a family reunion. Others brought sorrow, news of a death, a home destroyed, a future uncertain. The ranchers and guards respected the privacy of these moments, understanding that the pain of separation was something they all shared. As Christmas approached, the mood on the ranch grew both festive and bittersweet. The Americans decorated the mess hall with pine branches and homemade ornaments. Mrs. Maybell baked extra pies, and the ranchers pooled their ration coupons to buy a few small gifts for the POWs: warm socks, a deck of cards, a harmonica. The prisoners, in turn, made gifts of their own carved wooden toys, hand-stitched handkerchiefs, and a painted sign that read "Fro Weihnachten" in careful script. On Christmas morning, the POWs and ranchers gathered together for a special breakfast. There was bacon, of course, and eggs, and even a little jam for the bread. Hans led the prisoners in a quiet song, a German carol that spoke of peace and home. The Americans listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes. For a moment, the war was forgotten, and all that remained was the simple joy of being together. After breakfast, the men exchanged gifts and shook hands. The guards, usually so formal, relaxed their watch for a few hours, allowing the POWs to walk the ranch, enjoy the sunshine, and savor the rare feeling of freedom. Some of the prisoners wrote letters home that day, describing the kindness they had received, the food they had eaten, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different when the war was over. But even as the bonds between POWs and ranchers deepened, the reality of war was never far away. News from Europe was grim: battles raged, cities burned, and the end seemed both near and impossibly far. Some of the POWs worried about what would happen when the fighting stopped. Would they be sent home? Would their families still be there? Would they ever see Germany again? The ranchers, too, faced uncertainty. Some had lost loved ones in the fighting. Others worried about the future of their land, their crops, and their way of life. Yet, in the midst of all this, the simple act of sharing a meal of breaking bread and bacon together remained a source of comfort and connection. As winter gave way to spring, the POWs prepared for another season of work. The fields needed planting, the cattle needed tending, and the rhythms of ranch life continued. The memory of that first bacon breakfast lingered, a symbol of hope and humanity in a world still at war. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Hans wrote in his diary, "I do not know what the future holds, but I know that here, in this place, I have found kindness. I have remembered what it means to be human. And for that, I am grateful." Spring brought new life to the Texas ranch. Wildflowers painted the fields in bursts of color, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh grass and the lowing of cattle. For the German POWs, the change in season brought a sense of renewal, but also a growing restlessness. Rumors swirled through the barracks, rumors of Allied victories, of the war in Europe drawing to a close, of Germany's cities in ruins and families scattered by the chaos. Each letter from home was read and reread. Every scrap of news dissected and discussed late into the night. The work on the ranch continued. But the mood had shifted. The POWs moved with a new urgency, eager to fill their days with purpose, to keep their minds from wandering to the uncertainty that lay ahead. The ranchers noticed the change. And so did the gods. There was more laughter now, but also more quiet moments. More men staring off into the distance, lost in thought. One morning, as the sun rose over the fields, Mrs. Maybell decided to cook a breakfast the POWs would never forget. She woke before dawn, stoked the fire, and set to work. The kitchen filled with the familiar, comforting aroma of bacon frying, eggs scrambling, and bread toasting. She made enough for everyone: prisoners, guards, ranch hands, and even a few neighbors who had come to help with the spring roundup. When the POWs entered the mess hall, they stopped in their tracks. The tables were set with care, the plates piled high, and the room was filled with the warmth of home. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, as if on cue, the men took their seats, bowed their heads, and began to eat. The taste of bacon, the richness of the eggs, the simple pleasure of a good meal shared with others, it was almost too much. Some of the men wept openly, unashamed. Others smiled through their tears, grateful for the kindness that had been shown to them in a foreign land. After breakfast, Hans stood and addressed the room. His English had improved over the months, and his voice was steady as he spoke. "We are far from home, and we do not know what the future will bring. But here, on this ranch, we have found kindness. We have been treated not as enemies, but as men. For this, we thank you from our hearts." The ranchers and guards listened in silence, moved by the sincerity of his words. Some shook hands with the POWs, others clapped them on the back. The barriers that had once separated them, language, uniform, the wounds of war had faded, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. As the days grew longer and the news from Europe became more hopeful, the POWs began to prepare for the possibility of going home. Some were excited, eager to see their families and rebuild their lives. Others were anxious, uncertain of what awaited them in a country devastated by war. The ranchers, too, felt a mix of emotions. They had come to rely on the POWs, not just for their labor, but for their friendship. The thought of saying goodbye was bittersweet. When the end of the war was finally announced, the ranch erupted in celebration. The Americans cheered, fired rifles into the air, and hugged one another. The POWs gathered quietly, some weeping with relief, others simply sitting in stunned silence. For many, the reality of freedom was almost impossible to grasp, and the weeks that followed, preparations were made for the POWs' return to Germany. The men packed their few belongings, wrote farewell letters, and said their goodbyes on the morning of their departure. Mrs. Maybell cooked one last breakfast, a feast of bacon, eggs, and fresh bread. The men ate in silence, savoring every bite, knowing it would be a long time before they tasted such food again. As the trucks arrived to take them away, the POWs lined up in the yard, shaking hands with the ranchers, the guards, and each other. Hans embraced Mrs. Maybell, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The convoy rolled out, leaving the ranch quiet and still. The Americans watched until the trucks disappeared over the horizon, then returned to their work, the memory of their guests lingering in every corner of the ranch. For the German POWs, the journey home was long and uncertain. Many returned to cities in ruins, families scattered, and a country struggling to rebuild. But they carried with them the memory of Texas, the wide open skies, the kindness of strangers, and the taste of bacon on a spring morning. Some wrote letters to the ranchers, sending thanks and news of their lives. A few even returned to America years later, seeking out the people and places that had shown them unexpected mercy. The story of the Texas ranch and its German POWs became a legend in the community, told and retold at family gatherings, in church halls, and around campfires. It was a story of war, yes, but more than that, it was a story of humanity, the power of a simple meal to bridge the deepest divides, the ability of kindness to heal even the oldest wounds. Years later, when Hans was an old man, he would tell his grandchildren about the ranch in Texas, about the cook who made bacon for the enemy, and about the morning when hardened soldiers broke down at breakfast. "Never forget," he would say, "that even in the darkest times, there is goodness in the world. Sometimes, all it takes is a little kindness and a plate of bacon to remind us who we are." As the sun set over the Texas ranch, the fields bathed in golden light, the story lived on, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the simple truth that, in the end, we are all just people, hungry for hope and grateful for a place at the table. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe for more real moments from history. What's the most powerful act of kindness you've heard about in wartime? Tell us in the comments. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of small kindnesses.